is there something that like when you are doing liturgy, that you are most excited about performing or most excited about engaging with?
Huh. That's a great question. It's not so much a part of the liturgy or something that I do liturgically within a particular ritual. It's more the experience that a liturgical presider or even participant, even if you're not presiding, has. It's this experience, this sense of privilege that comes with being in a position of that sort, where you are gathering the assembly around holy things to engage holy things and to practice as a body. And it's a privilege even to be a part of such a body and to do such ritual practice, but especially as a presider or a preacher, there's just this enormous sense of joy and privilege in being able to gather the assembly to attend to the holy, to be in that position. I mean, I've been a priest in the Episcopal Church for, I don't know, I've lost track, 33 years, something like that, 34 years maybe. Um, and even now, after all these years, I am not infrequently struck by the extraordinary privilege of being in that space and the responsibility that you have of gathering people and making a space where they might worship, where they might experience something of the transcendent imminently. So that's really the experience, the outstanding experience of it for me.
Yeah. And I like how there's a marriage between or a marriage among there's this respect and reverence that you get to have this like privilege, and then also there's this joy element where you get to be among others and you get to kind of facilitate moments where they can kind of engage with their worship and deepen it or have some or be open to transcendent elements and holy elements. And I was curious because
Mm-hmm.
you have a dual practice. How about that? With both Episcopal Church and
Mm-hmm.
also within Soto Zen. And I know that with Soto Zen, there's Zazen where you're seated. Sometimes, if you're near a temple, or if you can be in a temple, you'll be seated on a platform or around a wall with each other. Do you get that same
Uh-huh.
kind of feeling when you're around people in a Buddhist context?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too, because particularly, of course, as you well know, there's so much variety in Zen communities now in the US. But if they're sitting in the kind of traditional way in Soto Zen, where everyone is facing the wall, it's different. There is an experience, and of course, there I'm not usually leading, although now and again I get invited to give a Dharma talk of some sort. Um, but being a participant, this experience of being in the space with others, but on your own, the sort of individual, which is ironic, isn't it, given that Buddhism is sort of aiming toward a kind of non-attachment to self. But within that framework, there is a sense in a Zoto Zen tradition where everyone's facing the wall. You're gathered, you're part of a body. You can feel that. You can feel people's body heat in the room and the kind of energy that comes with an assembly of any kind, but you're not facing each other, and it sort of brings the individual a bit more to the foreground. Whereas when I'm in the Eucharist, say, in a Christian setting, um, certainly now, and certainly in my tradition, the predominant pattern, though not in all places, is that the entire assembly will be facing one another around the place where the word is read, the place where people are baptized, the place where the table or the altar where Eucharist is done. So it's a different experience. They both feel very corporate to me. Um, but there's something kind of it's less a sense of joy as much as it is a sense of steadiness in the Zen environment. That people are there, but there's not direct face-to-face interaction. Very different kind of vibe. That's a great question. I'm not really sure that if I've thought about it, I haven't vocalized it until you asked it. So
Yeah.
it's a good question.
Oh, good. Yeah, I appreciate you kind of addressing how there's this individual relationship where you as an individual are not facing the rest of the group, and that whereas within an Episcopal practice you can within a service and worship. I saw some of the angling on some of the pews. I grew up in a Catholic household. I don't know if a lot of the terminology is the same, but are they called pews, or is that
Very, very similar in the Episcopal Church to any Roman Catholic terminology you would have. Yeah, pews,
gotcha?
basically. Yeah.
Great. I think it's great how there's like multiple angles where there are facing the altar space, and then you can make eye contact with fellow congregants across the space. Whereas when you're sitting zazen, you are facing a wall. Whereas like maybe in Rinzai you're facing in. But yeah, so thank you for kind of going into that. And I was curious, like how did your dual practice sort of develop? Like how did you have that openness to going to that temple for the first time, or that center for the first time?
Well, I was studying at the time. It's a dual answer. One is my first direct encounter with Zen, but the other part of the answer will be having to do with a kind of an important relationship I had as a very young man in my teen years, and even yeah, pretty much teen years. Um, so, the direct answer is that I was in graduate school studying with John Fenton, who has now died. Um, and I was in a graduate seminar on what he called cross-cultural theology. It's probably what we would be more likely to call today in the academy comparative theology. So we were reading ancient figures, Augustine and Suda Dionysius and so forth in the Christian tradition, and then also reading in the Indian tradition, reading Shankara and Ramanuja, and then reading Thomas Aquinas in the Christian tradition, and then eventually all leading into engaging with the Kyoto school of Buddhism, which was such a major movement in the relationship between Buddhism and the West in the 20th century. And I was quite fascinated in particular by reading Dogen. That was my first encounter with Dogen, and we had I no longer remember what, but some number of sections from the Shobogenzo, and I knew that there was a Soto Zen center in Atlanta, not far from where I lived, and I thought, well, maybe, I mean, I'm already a Christian, I'm already a priest when I'm in graduate school, I'm already tuned to understanding that religious practices are not a bunch of beliefs that people have in their heads. They're performances accompanied by and connected to beliefs. And so, I've said I need to go see what these Zen people do. So I end up down at the Atlanta Soto Zen Center, and I expected the place to be large. I don't know, like a lot more people than they had. And at the time, they were very small. And I walked in the door on the day I chose to visit, and I think maybe there were 5 other people in the room besides the Roshi. And I had a decision I had to make about what I was going to do about this. And but always with a fairly liberal orientation, even as a Christian, to God honoring wherever we seek and find truth. I swallowed hard and I said, I'm just going to join this group and I'm going to sit with them and see what it's about. And the rest is history, as they say. I found it such a compelling experience to to, I got the teaching on how you sit and very basic introduction to it and so forth. But I was coupling it with this advanced analysis of Dogen's writings in this graduate seminar. And I just was really moved and taken by it. But the other part of the story is growing up with a very close relationship in my teen years with my maternal grandmother, who was very open to the truths of many religious paths, truth wherever it could be found. And she certainly attended church with us on the major feasts in the Episcopal Church. I grew up Episcopalian. And yet she was this quiet model of a person who thought that the spiritual search should and could be spacious, and that probably spiritual truth was larger than any of the particular religious traditions that we locate it in. And so I gradually became aware in my mid-teens, and then she died when I was 16. But in my mid-teens, I was becoming aware of the fact that she had the writings of the Theosophical Society on her shelf, which is not such a huge thing in the US now, but was a bit of a peculiar sort of Buddhist blend thing going on at that time, back in the 1970s is when I'm talking about, was my interaction with her. And that she had the Vedas there, and she had the Jewish Psalms there, which she loved. And she read novels and literature like that of Pearl S. Buck, that were sort of, at least for that time, kind of crossing cultural boundaries and crossing traditions. And that got planted in me, as simplistic as it sounds. It got planted in me that that was okay, that the heavens were not going to fall, and that God would not judge you if you were open to finding truth wherever it came to you from. And even in interaction with traditions that didn't understand God the way you did, or might not even be focused in any significant way on a transcendent divine figure, whatever that being's relationship was, or power of being's relationship was with the world. So that stuck with me over the years. And when the opportunity came to study and to have a more direct encounter with traditions other than my own, I felt like I could take that opportunity. And the reason I stuck with the Zen practice, even though I was a Christian and a priest, not that I took it lightly at all. I actually wrestled with it a lot, but ultimately I just had to say, the Zen practice was doing something for me. I was finding something there. And if God, as Christians understand God, desires our abundant fullness of life, and I was finding some life there in the Zen practice, then I had to just follow that and trust it and see where it took me. And I ended up in the long term staying with it. And I've had many moments over the years where I've had to kind of wrestle with, what am I to make of this dual practice myself? But I keep following the dual path because I keep finding life there. And that seems to me to be the litmus test, is, do you find life there in these practices? And I do. So
Yeah. Is that shared among your colleagues within the Episcopal environment, where you've spoken with other people about where they find life, and it can kind of be up to how they, as their individual beings, interact with the world, where they might find life in food-based charities, or they might find life in a bowling league that is particularly fulfilling for them, or something like that. I don't, can it be diverse among your colleagues, or are you kind of an outlier by going into a Buddhist field by doing this?
Well, it kind of depends on the scope you're putting around that question. So in my institution at Virginia Theological Seminary, I am the only one that engages in another spiritual tradition as robustly as I do, which is not to say I don't have colleagues who are not also very open to where truth can be found in other traditions. But they don't, I'm the only one that has a kind of a dual practice going on. If you stretch that scope out, though, to the Episcopal Church broadly, say, I mean, there's lots of places you could, cut, but let's just say in the whole Episcopal Church, you'll run into Episcopalians who will make jokes about being a Buddhapalian, in that they are active members of Episcopal churches, but they've found their way to a sitting community, to a Buddhist community, and also participate to some degree in the life of that Buddhist community. And the history of the Episcopal Church is that it has a generous enough sense of what orthodoxy is that there is room for that. Now, I should be clear and honest and say at the same time, we have had a couple of instances in the kind of public life of the Episcopal Church. In one case, a person that was very actively involved in the Buddhist tradition as an Episcopal priest was elected as a bishop of a diocese, but his consecration did not go forward because he couldn't get the broad approval. We have a mechanism, we don't have to get into the details of that, but he couldn't get the broad approval required of other dioceses around the church because people had questions about what this meant, that he was an Episcopal priest, was going to be a bishop, but had a Zen practice. And we've even had an instance of a very lovely, very powerful teacher, African-American woman who was an Episcopal priest who did and still does understand herself to be both Christian and Muslim. And that's another one that a lot of people struggled to understand, and others found very liberating, and found her to be a very powerful spiritual teacher. But she couldn't quite get on the same page with her bishop on that, and ultimately is no longer now a priest, but does still practice as both Christian and Muslim. So we've had a couple of instances where if people are really public about this and they're about to be called into a position like Episcopal leadership, it's just a little bit of a bridge too far for some Episcopalians. But broadly in the Episcopal Church, you'll find all kinds of people in our pews who draw from the wells of more than one source, whether it's Buddhist practice or whether it's yoga practice, whatever. So it kind of depends on how narrowly you're asking the question, what the answer on that is going to be. But I think my colleagues here at Virginia Seminary have mostly come to understand me. And if they are still not, if they're still a little puzzled about how it is that being Buddhist is not only not in contradiction with, but supports in important ways my Christian practice, even if they don't understand it fully, they've kind of come to trust me, that I'm not doing some sort of bizarre, unsupportable thing that they can't live with. So that's a long answer to a short question.
No,
but it's a complicated answer because it really does depend on who you ask.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the depth that you gave me on that, because it helps me just understand where in the general sense, no real issue with kind of blending and having different flavors and colors kind of happen as you seek your truth within an Episcopal framework. However, when you get into leadership, titles, when you get into organizational elements, it can create some tensions, and that's I understand that is a possibility. And I was curious too, like, I'm so glad, and it sounds like you're, very grateful for your relationship with your maternal grandmother and how she opened you up. And I was curious about how those conversations would spark, because it coming out of like for your maternal grandmother, was it like a curiosity that she was sharing, or did it start with you kind of asking questions? Was like, what is this book exactly, or what is this thing, and then I'll share it with you, or was this kind of like, hey, by the way, it's important that you remain open here, that you have to kind of like see other things. And I was also curious too about like how she was viewed within, as you're, and I appreciate your contextualizing it, where not everyone was thinking this way, not everyone was doing this, how she was kind of perceived by maybe the Christian community or the others when you were growing up.
Mm-hmm. Well, it emerged very organically, in that I started getting more spiritually interested um, when I was 12, 13, 14 in my own tradition. And as I became more spiritually interested and involved more deeply in the church, then these conversations around my own spiritual experience, as a 13, 14-year-old, just really very much barely growing into this in terms of my own intentional commitment. And and some of the rest of my family actually thought it was a little odd that a 14-year-old was this interested in spiritual practice. But my grandmother was completely non-judgmental and curious enough about my own experience to invite me to talk about it. And she would answer my questions about her own beliefs when I asked them. But what I remember about her in my bones is her just making a space for me to talk about the questions I had and what sort of how I was interpreting sort of experiences that I had when I was in prayer. And she would sometimes just tell me some about her own thoughts in response, but it was mostly just making the space for me to talk. Um, the more I began to realize what was on her shelf and how spiritually open she was, the more I began to ask her some about her own beliefs and practices. And she would answer anything I wanted to ask, but it was never really an environment where she explained anything more than I wanted to know about. So it was very easygoing, very non-defensive, kind of open space is what it really was.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. I think that is a I'm so glad that you had this experience where you had this open space, this kind of permission, and also this inquiry, by your maternal grandmother asking you questions. It kind of helped you articulate and vocalize certain things that you had and experiences that you were having with prayer and just in general. Hi there, this is a quick production note to mention that our first recording had a technical glitch to it, so this episode consists of two recordings, and the following is the second recording. When we talked about uh, your maternal grandmother and your relationship with your maternal grandmother, you talked about this kind of curiosity that you developed, and that you had in your youth. And I was curious because you have this lane, or you're kind of pursuing Soto Zen, but you also incorporate Shingon, you incorporate some Tibetan Buddhism, and I was just kind of curious how you have been exploring that and how that's been kind of welcome additions into your practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I mean, you've put your finger on something, which is that I am, though trained as a theologian, I am fundamentally a liturgical and sacramental theologian. So I think from practices. And so, although my own Buddhist practice has been centered in the Zen tradition, and the relative simplicity of that, ritually speaking, those certainly still can be quite elaborate, um, compared to other forms of Buddhism, has been the sort of right complement to me, where I already have a very, very rich liturgical life in the Christian tradition, in my home tradition. I tend to be sort of on the Catholic end of the Catholic Reformed combination that Anglicanism is anyway. But at the same time, what that also leads me to really appreciate are the few occasions I've had to cross paths with esoteric forms of Buddhism, like that on Mount Koyasan and Koyasan, Mount Koya. Never really had the chance to visit Mount Hiei, so though I'm hoping I'm still going to be able to do that. It's on some future trip. Um, but I did see the practices there, and I did, while I taught at Bethany College in West Virginia, for purely practical reasons that had to do with the timing. I drove in every weekend from Wheeling, West Virginia, where I lived, to Pittsburgh, where there was a Tibetan Buddhist community that met, that was the right time for me to meet. There's also a Soto Zen community there, but I had to travel all the way from Wheeling to get there and couldn't work it out. So I sat with them for a good probably year and a half or close to 2 years of that 5 years that I was there. And I deeply appreciated the kind of ritual dimensions of visualization practices and chanting. You know, there is meditation, which is a kind of a silent way of accessing the awareness that we're seeking. But then there's also sonic ways to do that with chanting, and visual ways to do that. And there's a way in which, much like my home tradition in Christianity, different schools of Buddhism foreground different aesthetics. And I mean that in the rich sense, not in a kind of dismissive sense. They all form different sorts of aesthetic paths, some more sonic, some more visual, some more silent, some thinner, some thicker in ritual practices. And that in itself, I appreciate, largely because, of course, I am also a scholar of religion, and as practitioners of all these traditions, sometimes don't know as well as they should themselves the internal diversity of my own tradition, of Christianity, of Buddhism, of Hinduism, of Taoism. There's an enormous amount of internal diversity within those traditions. So being involved in those other practices from time to time have given me some appreciation of the diversity of Buddhism, which is the envelope around my own continuing practice of Zazen. That's likely to remain the center of my practice. But I appreciate the introduction to all those other faces of Buddhism, if you will.
Yeah.
We talk about these traditions way too much in the singular. And you have to have some kind of language to use, right? This is, when we're working with sort of the conditioned and the dual and the diverse, you've got to have some kind of language for this. And so in some sense, say just in one town in the United States, a Baptist, a Catholic, an Episcopalian, an Evangelical Lutheran, a Missouri Synod Lutheran, two different kinds of Presbyterian, three different kinds of Methodists, and on and on. We're really much better to call these things in the plural, I think, really Christianities or Buddhisms. And so, having a little bit of a dip into Tibetan practices and seeing a little bit of the Japanese esoteric practice that was behind, in a broad sense, behind Dogen's own practice, has given me an appreciation for the great internal diversity that exists in Buddhism, no different than my own tradition, which of course means that's the case with every religious tradition with which we give a singular name, right? But they all have many faces.
Yeah. And I really do enjoy that. That really unlocked a lot for me. I think it was John Strong. I think or Jonathan Strong is the
Uh-huh.
author, but it's like the book is called Buddhisms. And I was just
Yes.
like, yeah, like
Yes.
that is such a cool it was a really helpful tool or resource for me just to understand that these are expressions, and it can be a plural, and then by kind of acknowledging its diversity kind of creates like this envelope, and it creates this like larger um
Mhm.
uh experience that you can all have,
Mhm.
and of all these paths kind of winding in and out of each other. And I really do love
Yes.
it when authors, like I think even DT Suzuki wrote about Shin Buddhism or Jodo Shinshu.
Yes.
And so there's just this kind of appreciation for multiple traditions within the tradition,
Yes.
and that flexibility is really, really
That's right.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I've only recently discovered that one of our major Anglican theologians, Thomas Traherne, who comes from kind of a classical period of Anglican theology, when it was certainly much more English than global than it is now, but nevertheless, a really interesting theologian. And I was led by one of our librarians here at Virginia Seminary to a reference that Suzuki made in one of his books to Thomas Traherne, who felt like he saw in something that Traherne was writing the kind of non-duality that he was attempting to introduce to the US and teach and exemplify in the Buddhist tradition. So, of course, you've got this internal diversity, but then you also have these interesting ways in which, while the rhetoric within the traditions can sometimes feel very exclusive, that also depends in part on the tradition and in part on the particular sub-tradition. But while they can all at times feel that way, the truth is I'm comfortable, in fact, I defend the notion that there are real boundaries around these traditions, but they're permeable boundaries. We can recognize across traditions resonances, right? I can't remember that phrase or even who it was. It might have been Mark Twain who said something about history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. You know, we may not be all doing the same thing across these traditions, but there sure is some rhyming going on between certain dimensions of one tradition and certain dimensions of another. So you've got all this wonderful internal diversity, then you also have this possibility of learning across these permeable membranes that are around us.
Yeah.
So I love that, and I think, back to my grandmother. I think, she wasn't a scholar. I don't think she finished high school. Um, Certainly was not coming to this from the point of view of the kind of scholarship of the nature of religions that you would read in somebody like Talal Asad. She just, at the experiential level, recognized that there was some rhyming going on here. It was sort of open to listening to it and seeing where it took her. So you can, from a scholarly point of view, mount a very strong argument that these traditions have always been permeable to one another, but you don't even have to do that. You don't have to go at it from that point of view. You can simply say, I'm comfortable in my own tradition. I am therefore willing to recognize that there may be truths I do not know in another tradition, and I can simply be open and see where that takes me. Right? It's for me, it's always been kind of guided by the statement by Simone Weil, who was herself a very interesting figure, a Jew who never converted to Christianity, but was deeply fascinated by and taken by the symbol of Christ and the person of Christ and all of that. And her phrase was at one point, if you have to choose between Christ and truth, always choose truth, for you will never go far before falling into Christ's arms. Now, that works for you if you're a Christian, right? As I am in my home tradition. And yet it's interesting enough that it was a statement by a Jewish woman regarding Christianity, where even if she had come to see Christ as encompassing the final ground of things, this general principle that we need not fear truth wherever we find it has to be something that we can do as spiritual practitioners, regardless of the tradition that we come from.
Yeah.
So it
But
seems to me.
yeah, what a powerful openness and way of phrasing and way of kind of encouraging that almost it reminds me of like a Zen phrasing where it's like if you see the Buddha coming down the road, you kill him, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
I don't know, I can't venture to really say that I can understand that phrase perfectly accurately, but there is this thing of understanding that uh, you know, kind of idealizing a certain form or a certain thing as Buddhist isn't necessarily a way to go, right? It's more like, it can be
Right.
it could be other things. So kind of through the identifying killing it, like in the sense of like just destroy that part of your mind that's linking something to something material
Yes.
and held fast, right? Okay.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
so there's another kind of parallel, right? But that allows for a lot more because once you destroy that idealized version, then you are open to really all kinds of things being truth.
That's right. That's right. And if what you're committed to, you remain um, convinced, persuaded, moved by as truth, then surely that cannot be, from a purely logical point of view, completely contradictory to something else that is also truth, right? If it exists somewhere else as well, there's got to be a way that those two different truths, those two different angles of view talk to one another. I love that you brought that phrase up about I won't claim either to have, attained awakening and understand fully what that line is, but I have often quoted it to Christians when I'm trying to explain some of what appeals to me about Buddhism. And one of the things that Buddhism has done for me is make me more sensitive to what in my tradition, or of course in the Jewish or the Muslim tradition, you would call idolatry. And Buddhism is really good, it seems to me, in sensitizing us to the fact that you can get rid of the rest of all of these other attachments, but the last and final attachment to go is the attachment to Buddha, right? It's Dogen's always going beyond Buddha, or do not seek to become a Buddha, just sit and go beyond Buddha. There's this sensitivity there that our tendency to attach in Buddhist language or to idolatrize things in Abrahamic language is so deep and insidious that the last one to go in all of our traditions is that we become attached to the tradition. So instead of seeking, adoring, wondering over that which the tradition points to, the tradition itself becomes the last idol. And of course, Buddhists don't use the language idolatry so much. That's again language from the Abrahamic side of things. But I think I have become much more attuned over the years to the capacity of Christians to reify Christ in such a way that instead of following one that we take to be somehow crucified but risen and present still, um, we uh, we attach ourselves to some particular idea of him that we have. Now, I want to be fair to my home tradition. There are Christians who are sensitive to that kind of idolatry. People like Meister Eckhart proclaiming, "Oh God, deliver me from God," right? Which surely has to be something similar going on there. Or John of the Cross, who says, in your seeking of the experience of God, you have to let go of the desire for the experience of God. Even that has to go. So again, there's some rhyming going on there, but I don't think I noticed that part about my own home tradition until I had practiced Buddhist meditation for many years and read the sutras and listened to some teachers talk about this. And so there are many ways, and probably I'm not a very good Buddhist because, I still, I'm what Fabian Volker would probably call an asymmetric non-dualist, right? At the end of the day, I can't and don't, as Christian, give up on the notion of God as a final kind of ground of all reality in a way that can be articulated quite dynamically, but that still may not satisfy any number of Buddhists who want a kind of symmetric, full-blown non-dualism. Um, So I'm probably not a very good Buddhist in that regard, but nevertheless, my Christianity is now much more Buddhist in that the sensitivities I bring to it, I think, come as much from the Zazen as it does from my own Christian practice. I mean, it's in my tradition, it's in the other tradition. It's that rhyming thing again, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think there's also something very powerful about you being aware and having that that faith and that conviction that there is this uh, overarching kind of God that is present in this mysterious and expansive way that for you you find like you're not able to walk uh, in according to yourself of like a perfectly Buddhist trajectory because of like the because it would acknowledging the existence of that would kind of strain this idea of a dualism.
Yeah.
Um, but there is something very powerful about how exploring the Buddhist path, and I don't know how much this resonates with you, but like it sounds like through your study, through your listening and exploring through meditation and zazen and reading from these scholars, is that it creates like a doubt. Like I feel like when I engage with dualism, it makes me have to doubt things. It makes me have to second guess things and look again. And uh, it in that way can be extremely powerful for re engaging with that conviction or that faith. At the same time too, when you balance your Anglican faith with a Buddhist path as well.
Yeah, and yeah, that's right. I mean, there's I love the title of this book, and with all apologies to a great senior scholar in the field of religion and theology, I don't love the book itself. I don't like anything about the book. But Paul Knitter, who was a professor of theology for many years at Union Seminary in New York, has a little book that he wrote. It's kind of more for kind of a popular, broader audience than just a purely scholarly book. But the title of the book is Without the Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian. Now, what I don't love about the book is I think I find that he presents some of the most simplistic and unnuanced claims and practices that Christians engage in, and then sort of complicate that and complexify it, and enrich it with Buddhism, when in fact there are plenty of things that Christianity has to offer that are a good bit more nuanced than what he describes. Be that as it may, this remarkable thing that engaging with our religious neighbor may make us better at the practice of our own tradition. I just think that's a remarkable thing. It is in some sense, and again, I don't want to impose too much of my own understanding on this, but it is in some sense, it seems to me, maybe what Muhammad, blessed be his name, was writing, dictating, or taking in the dictation of the angel, as their tradition has it, in the Quran, when he says God has made us diverse so that we require and learn from one another. That this is a good that we were made in this way. So I think even if you're not a dual practitioner like I am, which still to a lot of religious people, certainly Christian, probably plenty of Buddhists as well, they find that a little odd. Even if you're not a dual practitioner, just being a good conscientious follower of your own path, I find it remarkable and wonderful and a kind of mystery that I can be driven deeper into my own path by what I learn from someone on another path. And then, of course, when you do get into the dual practice thing, then I'm not the only one who said, first person that said this or the only one that says it, but as a dual practitioner, the strange thing about that is that the interreligious engagement is not occurring between you and the neighbor, but the interreligious dialogue is in you. It's in your own head and mind and heart. So what I learned from Buddhism is always teaching, critiquing, and being critiqued by what I believe and know as a Christian. And what I find in Christianity is always being critiqued and enriched by what I find in Buddhism and my Buddhist practice. And there's a certain point at which, well, I'll just say if there's ever a point at which, and this is probably different from one dual practitioner to the next, but if there is ever a point at which these things will somehow resolve, if that's the right word, or perfectly mesh or reconcile in my own life, I'm open to seeing that happen. But the richness of it for me at this point is that I now have two voices in my head, if you will. Two hearts in my body actually is a better metaphor, the more I practice each of them. And that's sometimes exasperating, particularly when you run up against things that you think just really can't be reconciled, but you just stay with it. And again, in that sentiment that Simone Weil gives us, I kind of feel like, okay, I experience this as true, and I experience this other thing as true, and I'm experiencing those two things in practice, in liturgy and in meditation. I can either say I must be mistaken, which of course I might be about one or both, or I can say, the truth doesn't depend on me, right? It doesn't need me to defend it or articulate it. So I'm just going to sit with those two different paths that at certain points seem to diverge from one another. And I'm just going to have to somehow straddle both of them and let that be and just see what happens over time. So anyway, yeah, but this all back to this issue you raised, that this is kind of, learning from the spiritual other, the religious other, whether that is firmly rooted in one tradition or whether that dialogue is going on in your own head, I think is wonderful. It's been one of the richest things of my life, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, your phrasing of having the two hearts in my body, it's like it's a very powerful, I'd imagine being a very powerful thing to have embodied, but also it's just a powerful thing to hear. And because it gives credence to both things as a life sustaining, life force sort of condition or aspect of oneself. So that's a really powerful way of visualizing and understanding it. And yeah, I mean, it seems like it generates so much. Yeah, it creates maybe some discomfort when you see something diverge, and then you're kind of like, "Whoa, wait a minute," and then you'll find yourself once again coming at a crossroads where both paths kind of meet, and you're like, "Oh, this is where I can both I can see happening existing at the same time and having a symbiotic relationship." And
Yeah.
and with your scholarship and with your background and everything, you operate and you educate and you work within a Episcopal environment, and yet you will find yourself on Mount Koya. And I was just curious, like, what was that experience like, watching a service happen with all of your knowledge and experience coming beforehand?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, it was fascinating because it was an experience. See if I can come up with the right vocab for this. So when I'm in a Christian liturgy, and it's an English-speaking liturgy, now this could be the case with a Christian liturgy in a language I don't speak as well, but in a Christian liturgy, which is English-speaking or English and Spanish-speaking in most of the places I spend my time, I know I have some sense of what's happening in the ritual practice because it also coordinates the practice, and the materiality of liturgy also coordinates with the use of words and language, right? I mean, Roy Rappaport says ritual is basically a more or less formal sequence. Uh, uh, I think I'm going to garble that a little bit. A more or less formal, more or less fixed. This is not quite right, but I'm close. So we'll say I'm paraphrasing Rappaport. a more or less fixed series of formal acts and utterances through which people, this is now my language, not his, sort of enact the world as they understand it to be and as they return to deepest reality as they understand it to be. So if I'm in a Christian tradition, it was a long way around to coming back and saying, if I'm in the Christian tradition, I can follow the words and I can track the actions, and I follow the congruence of those things. Walking onto Mount Koya for the first time and spending a couple of days in one of the temples there, which I did, and then going to the fire rituals, right? The Goma or Homa tradition, depending on which tradition you're in, Homa or Goma ritual. There was an environment where I did not understand what was being chanted. I am not fluent in Japanese. I'm not even close to fluent in Japanese. So I had no access to the language. I only had access to the ritual action. And yet, after so many years of studying as well as practicing both Christian liturgy and then also Soto Zen practices in a language I also understand, there was this strange familiarity to it, or something like that, where I didn't entirely know what the purpose of each action was, but I did get the sense as a scholar of liturgy that their tradition, like my tradition, like in the Jewish tradition, like in the Muslim tradition, that a lot of what ritual is about is the sequence in which things are done. It's a particular fixed set of actions. They're done in a certain order, and they are what they are in motion, right? So I could feel the movement of the rite. I could feel where the crescendo was, the point in the ritual where the remembrances of ancestors and the prayers that those who were gathered were offering. And I was the only Anglo in the room. I mean, I'm quite sure that other Anglos visit Mount Koya, but the particular trip I took, I was surrounded by Japanese pilgrims. I was the only English-speaking white face, white Western face in the room. But I could still feel it. And what I felt was that sense that ritual, whether it's Christian or Buddhist, is inviting you in your body to occupy a certain spaciousness, to invite a certain consent to something that's larger than you. Now, a Christian might call it God or Christ or the Spirit, and a Muslim might call it Allah, and Buddhists might say Buddha Dharma or something of that nature, or Tathagata Garbha or something. But there's this sense of consent and expectation, a sense that there was some kind of enactment happening that had a rise and a fall to it, a coming together and a dispersing at the beginning and the end, all of which have kind of ritual significance. So it was fascinating. I don't claim to be at all an expert in those rituals that I watched them do a couple of mornings, 3 mornings in a row, I think, actually. And yet there was something very familiar about it. Practitioners across traditions know, I think, what it is to come together as an assembly, and whatever the verbal content is that's used to describe what's going on there, what's really happening is a consent of the body and a joining to the assembly for something that occurs. An aspiration, a sense of desire, longing that's awakened in some sense. All of that seemed very familiar to me. Now,
Yeah.
was that in any way what the Japanese pilgrims who were around me were feeling or sensing? I think it probably was, because I think what I'm reading is the whole gathered body and their relationship to the ritual, but I can't be sure of that because not my language, not my culture. And I do so want to be careful about not colonizing other traditions' experiences from the standpoint of my own, right? None of us can escape that entirely because we're all contextually situated. We can only start from where we are. But you can be careful, I think, about not going with the assumption that, well, whatever's going on here must be just like what we do when we do this. So it's a sometimes uncomfortable line to walk as a scholar, to be in the midst of a ritual like on Mount Koya, and try not to colonize, but also draw on what you know from your study of ritual to see if you can work out something of what's happening, and just try to do that in a very respectful way. The Christian tradition has quite enough of a history of marching around the globe and colonizing people with an understanding of what it means to follow Christ that I would be hard pressed personally to recognize as what Christ himself seemed to be about. So I try to be careful about that. Anyway,
Yeah. No, I appreciate that sensitivity and that encouragement to kind of just acknowledge your own context and not try to bring that into how you interpret something, or at least trying to when you talk about something that you experience, that you're not trying to speak from some sort of authority by having been a witness and not being sure about what
mhm,
element this represents, or and also distinguishing between how your experience was versus what some of the Japanese pilgrims were experiencing as something different, maybe, not totally being sure. I think that's all
yeah.
definitely something to keep into consideration. And yet at the same time, it's really wonderful to hear how your experience being participating in rituals, seeing things that were familiar, and there you were, across an ocean, there with other people in a totally different context, totally different tradition and way of life, and yet you felt some resonances, and you felt some
Mhm,
of the same. Uh, you felt moved by elements of it at the
mhm.
same time. I think that's a really wonderful thing. And just for clarification, is the Homa or the Goma ritual, does that signify a certain thing, or is that something that is a weekly uh, practice within Shingon?
It's in Shingon, they do it every day. Now, I don't know about Tendai because I've never been to Mount Hiei, but my assumption is that those rituals, which, of course, speaking of permeable boundaries, a religious scholar, at the risk of giving offense, is going to say that's very clearly a lineage that came from India as the forms of what we now call Hinduism, which is itself a misnomer, informs Buddhism and travels east to East Asia. So it's recognizable across lines. But yeah, there, at least at the temple that I was at, the fire ritual was done every morning. And it was clear that pilgrims had come from all around, and many of the pilgrims had walked the mountain. Of course, Shugendo, this sort of mountain religion that's so much a part of Buddhism there. I think I have the word right. Um, there are so many folks, so many Japanese folks who do these pilgrimages, and they don't ride the funicular up the mountain they traverse all the way up the mountain. On Koya, they are ostensibly trekking up the way that Kobadaishi came when he founded that form of Buddhism on the mountain. And my sense is that those folks were there every morning, and as they walked back down Koya, they were headed toward somewhere else that they were pilgrims to as well. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was really quite remarkable. That experience I had, I think, can go both ways. Now, I'm going to garble this as well, but your watchers or listeners can go look it up in one of the texts of the that record the proceedings of the Gethsemane encounter and get the accurate version of this. But I'm close enough to convey the truth of it, even if I don't have the details quite right. But the story was told in one of those encounters, which were a series of encounters between Christian monks and monks from the East, largely Buddhist. There were some Hindus involved, some people representing Advaita Vedanta involved, but I think a lot of Buddhist Christian exchange, and they met at the monastery where Thomas Merton was when he was alive. at Gethsemane, thus Gethsemane encounter. And in one of these encounters, they had a habit in these meetings of attending in ways that they could without being colonizing or disrespectful or sacrilegious. They found ways to kind of sit in on one another's rituals. And there's a story of one Buddhist monk, again, disclaimer, little garbled, but close, a Buddhist monk who I think maybe went up to receive communion at the Catholic Mass rather than just being there, being in the assembly. There's no prohibition against that, but normally as a Buddhist, you wouldn't, of course, go to the altar in the Catholic context and receive the consecrated bread and wine. He did so and he returned to his seat. And the story, as I recall it, is that he was found a bit later at the end of the Mass, sort of weeping in his seat. And he was approached by, I don't know whether one of the Christian brothers or one of the Buddhist brothers or sisters, and just to see if he was all right and what was his reaction. And his response was very limited and something like experience of overwhelming love. And that's pretty much all he said. So this sense of this Buddhist coming to a Catholic context, participating in a liturgy, whether or not he should or shouldn't have, and of course, quite rightly, they were hospitable to him and went ahead and communicated him. And to come away from that without a great deal of depth or context in what Catholic Christianity was really about, somehow come away from that experience being touched by what Christians routinely identify as a part of what's going on when one is receiving communion. So this wonder, we're back again to this theme of this wonderful interreligious exchange that we can learn from each other without betraying our own tradition, without pre-deciding how to manage the points of convergence and the points of divergence, and just letting them take us where they will take them and trusting truth to lead us where it will.
Yeah. And I mean, not to impose too much of our conversation onto this account, which I have the book. I haven't quite read it yet, but now I'm very much inspired to pick it up. Is like this idea that we were talking about, where maybe this Buddhist monk, as they approached and received communion and sat back down, kind of allowed themselves to feed that second heart that they have, that they didn't know that they had before. And maybe there's a whole collection of hearts that can be fulfilled in various ways, just so long as you kind of open yourself to them. And no, again, like, I have not read this account and I'm just hearing this for the first time, but I do think that there's something very powerful about allowing yourself to be open and allow yourself to tread, even though you're firmly planted in your even garments with your tradition, as you approach something that's other, that receiving it with open arms, what that can do. It's very brave.
Well, and I feel like I should say, to be fair to the Buddhist tradition, I think the Buddhist tradition is, at least potentially, a little better at that, or at least can find a way to doing that without so much of a sense of threat than maybe a kind of monolatrous Abrahamic tradition like Christianity is. Because that whole distinction in Buddhism between conventional and ultimate truth, and the fact that we live in the ordinary and the ordinary is permeated by the ultimate, and they are not two. That it's not that you're driving through one and rejecting it for the same for the sake of the other, but that the ultimate ever appears in and only through form and so forth, right? I'm thinking about the Heart Sutra and this sort of thing. I mean, it's the ultimate manifests in the conditional as the conditional. And if you're operating with a kind of two truths doctrine, as some people call that in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, if you're operating with that kind of a doctrine, it makes it, I think it can make you more hospitable to the encounter of truths in other traditions than your own. Whereas the strong kind of monolatrous the worship of one God, right? That is an intrinsic and important part of the Abrahamic traditions, requires a little bit more work if you're a dual practitioner, or if you're not a dual practitioner, but you just want to learn something from another tradition. It does require a little bit of intellectual work, a little bit of theological work to get to a place where you can say, okay, I can do this, and the heavens are not going to crash down. And I mean, it reminds me of the Dalai Lama, who always, so famously, Christians would go to the Dalai Lama in the various places he would speak and say, I want to become a Buddhist, and how do I follow this way? And he would always discourage that and say, go back and be a deeper Christian. Go back and be a better, deeper Christian. And people often, certainly some of my students over the years, undergrad students in particular, thought, oh, see, he's just a swell, open, reasonable guy, a model of tolerance or something. And I'd always have to say, no. What he's doing is being very, very Buddhist. The ultimate is what there is, no matter what form of the conditions in which we encounter it. And so if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. You can encounter that ultimate as easily over here as you can over there. So I do think there is something in Buddhism that makes it innately somewhat more hospitable to the truths that we can find in other places. And that too, I think, has been something I have learned over the years about my own tradition, and trying to think of ways in which we can do that better and make sense of that better for people who are on the Christian side a little bit scandalized by this idea that you could do this kind of interreligious learning and think that it's just tantamount to infidelity somehow, which it isn't, but you do have to work at that a little bit, I think.
Yeah, there's like a vulnerability that you almost have to reconcile with a little bit as you kind of say, walk into a space and say, like, well, will my foundation receive some instability as a result of
Yes.
me
Yes.
breaching into something else?
Yes.
Uh, and it's really wonderful from your experiences and your scholarship that you have your background and you go to Mount Koya and you attend a service. And then I wanted to get into this. I believe it's true that you have visited Eiheiji. Is that right?
I did. On my last trip to Japan, I did go to Eiheiji. I didn't make it there the first time. Yeah.
Gotcha. Was and you're someone that can go into these deeply imbued with meaning places for their various traditions and sects, and you can go in there and be vulnerable, just like how you were when you went to the Atlanta Soto Zen Center in the beginning. And what was your experience like going to a place like Eiheiji, and that has you know was the beginning of a lot of the texts and the works that you read as a scholar, and being there where you're watching people move and interact in that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, again, it was like Koya, although since it is the headwaters of the Buddhist tradition I practice in, it was a little more familiar, but still a kind of strange familiarity. It is such a big place. They have such a large group of monks there. It's such a stunning place. My visits in Japan previously had been in Osaka and Nara and Kyoto and Tokyo, and I had not really gotten out to the hills, as it were. And to go out to Eiheiji, my wife traveled with me on this particular trip, and she went with me, and she too is a priest in the Episcopal tradition, and lifelong Episcopalian, but also very open to the truth and in both doctrine and practice in other traditions. But when she went up the mountain with me, eventually, I think after we'd wandered around a little bit, I said, "What do you think?" Because this was the first large temple of this type that she had seen, and she said, "I think this may be the most beautiful place I've ever traveled." And this is a person who's been all over the place, Jerusalem and South Africa and Europe, and just admitted she's a traveler. And she was just stunned by not just the beauty of it, but an immense beauty that itself approaches a kind of holiness. The place, like Christian monasteries that I have been to, I suppose, is so bathed in practice that the mountain itself felt to me, the buildings felt to me like they were all part of the practice. It was remarkable. They're set up to receive people who speak other languages besides Japanese. They have service books in English and other languages that they hustle over and give you when you go up to join them for the morning services. And they're very hospitable and kind of pointing out where you are. The Japanese part of the service is on one side and the English on the other. And but the entire introduction to Dogen's life, which they clearly do as a regular part of the visits pilgrims make, was entirely in Japanese. And I knew enough from my scholarship of Dogen that I could track occasionally, particularly when they put dates up on the board at certain times. I could track what they were saying, but of course couldn't really understand it. So it was, again, this feeling of walking into a world that is not your own, and in which you are at the edge of a mystery that is compelling and yet strange. And just see, of course, like most temples, parts or all of it have been destroyed at various times over the years and rebuilt and all of that. But just being in the space and going and visiting where Dogen's remains are, it was extremely moving. I think I only made that trip, I want to say maybe 8 or 9 months ago, and I think I'm still unpacking it in some ways. And it did also feel to me like a pilgrimage. My previous studies in Japan, I didn't quite feel as connected to some of the places that I was visiting, even though I could visit them and enjoy them, and there were many remarkable temples and so forth to visit. But because I have been reading Dogen since the early 90s in that graduate course that started all of this, to go there where he was buried and see the place that he founded as his last landing in his own life and leadership was just very powerful. It was very moving. It felt very much like a pilgrimage that I might make to, say, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem or something of that nature.
Yeah.
It was remarkable. I'm not sure I really have enough words for it yet.
Yeah. And totally understandable. I mean, like, I think it speaks to the profundity of it, where, you just have come back from it 8 or 9 months ago, and you're still kind of just, even your spouse is saying, well, that might have been the best spot. I mean, that might have been the best, most beautiful place I've ever traveled to. And you have this feeling of it being compelling and strange and sacred, from the rocks under the foundation of the temple to the people there, and to everything that's a part of it. And I've seen images online of it, and it really does look like this just aesthetically very sacred place.
It is beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a scholar, and I'm not going to wax eloquent or anything because I've just stumbled across the book myself. It's been out a few years, but there's a scholar by the name of Dearness who has a book called Senses of Devotion, and I've just begun to dig into it, in which he points out that there's been voluminous amounts written about religions at kind of the macro level, at the doctrinal level, and even at the level of the analysis of their rituals, but comparatively less attention paid to their spaces. as well as to the experience of what it means for a practitioner to be the thing they are, not at the macro level, but how it is woven into their ordinary life. But relevant to this spot in our conversation, it's his interest in the aesthetic, in the spatial, in the fact that there is something that the buildings and the spaces contribute to the feel of these traditions. And there's something very overpowering about a place like Eheji that has the weight of the centuries of faithful practice and struggle, and has survived the ages, and is every day, day in and day out, when you arrive as a pilgrim and long after you're gone, when they are just continuing these practices in their daily cycle. There's something very powerful and grounding about that, which I think you can equally find, but in a different key, right? In a beautiful mosque, or in a wonderful Christian basilica, or in an extraordinary synagogue in Cordoba or something. I mean, the spaces themselves do something to contribute to this. And it kind of takes me back to one of the questions you asked early on about that experience of being in ritual as a liturgical leader in the Christian tradition, as I am, but then sitting zazen in a Buddhist tradition as a layperson in that tradition. And the feeling that the spatial orientation itself brings to the meaning of the practice, the assembly in the church facing one another, the assembly in a at least classical Soto Zen setting together, but facing the wall, facing nothing but the wall, facing ultimately, as Taigen Danilaitan says, facing nothing but themselves and also the whole world, and facing that wall. The space itself does something to invite, to set the tone, to set the horizon under which the practice occurs and the quality of the practice is experienced. And I think that's a part of what I'm getting at when I say Eheji was so powerful. Not uniquely so. There have been Christian monasteries and other kind of religious sites I've felt that, but yeah, there's something important about space, and it is one of the things we've paid the least attention to in Western studies of religion, is the actual space and practices that people do, not just treating these religious traditions as a list of things you believe with your head, which is a mistake.
Yeah.
So.
I haven't had the fortune of going to a Hiji, and but I have had this experience, oddly enough. So I grew up Catholic, and it's not something that I respect that part of my history and part of my family's history, and it's just not something I feel like deeply connected to as far as what it is at the moment. But I remember having the great fortune of going to St. Peter's Basilica, and I remember walking into not just the Sistine Chapel, but like walking into the basilica itself,
Mhm.
and just feeling awesomeness. Like I
Mm.
felt like that awesomeness.
Yeah.
And you stand up and you look around and you see how high up the ceilings are, all the details that are in it. These details that are maybe like a foot large, but when you look at them from your angle, they're just miniature.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you're just like, wow, God lives here. Like, or, like you
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
really like
Yeah.
this has enough room in it for God to be here. And I say that as
Yeah.
someone.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Well, and he's a little out of fashion these days, but what I feel like you're describing in your experience, and probably fair to my experience at Aheji, is what Rudolf Otto used to refer to as the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, right? That something about these religious traditions, now, even if that's there's some kind of hidden monotheism behind that, there may be, that's a fair critique of him, but I don't think it has to be restricted to monotheistic traditions. I think that when we step into the holy spaces of these various traditions, sometimes very small ones, but also beautiful, large ones with long histories. It doesn't correspond to any one particular kind of space sometimes, and it depends on where the person walking in is in their own spiritual journey, but they can bring you to the edge of this mystery that both repels in its grandeur and makes you feel very small and maybe even at risk in some way. And yet it is unavoidably magnetic and draws you to it. And you have this sense that something holy is afoot here, even if it is well beyond what I can conceptualize with words. So your description of the basilica there at St. Peter's reminded me of Otto. I think something like that is probably what you were experiencing.
Yeah,
And what I
yeah.
was experiencing at Ahegi.
Yeah, and so I'm glad that you allow yourself opportunities to go on these pilgrimages or to visit these sites and like to have these in a multicultural, multi-traditional sense, and just allow yourself to find that truth, to find that living spiritual truth that we talk about
Yeah.
as you go about. I've really had a wonderful time with our conversation. I had one more question to ask you, and this is a little bit more broad, where I wanted to see if there's anything that you wanted to promote or to shine a light on, whether it's a foundation or a cause or anything that you would want to advise someone maybe on their Buddhist path or their Episcopalian path. And while you think about that, I can name some of your works here, some of the books that you published. There's Ritual Excellence: Best Practices for Leading and Planning Liturgy, T&T Clark Handbook of Sacraments and Sacramentality, the Liturgy Explained, and This is the Night: Suffering Salvation in the Liturgies of Holy Week. So yeah, and I know that there's more to come from you as an author. So if there's anything that you'd want to share, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I appreciate that. I have begun experimenting, being an old dinosaur, with writing on Substack. When I say begun, I mean maybe 2 or 3 months ago. And I've decided to try some short form writing there as a way of trying out what will perhaps become the next book after the ones that I'm working on now, which would be a bit more of a personal account of what this is meant to be a Christian who actively and unapologetically practices in the Soto Zen tradition. So it'd probably be a little more autobiographical than my other scholarly work has done. So for anybody that's interested in hearing a bit more of the technical and theological side of how I wrestle with this dual practice as a Christian theologian, you can check out the Substack. It's called Crossings, CROSS/INGS. And you can get in on the ground floor of whatever I have to say for whatever that's worth, because I think I'm coming up on my 4th entry in the next couple of days. I'm working on a book for Peter's Press called Here the Way Unfolds, phrase of Dogen's, of course, which is a Christian commentary on Dogen's Shobogenzo. So Peter's is a press that's connected to Louvain, and they have a wonderful series of Christian commentaries on non-Christian sacred texts. So I'm contributing a volume to that series, and that book's probably a couple of years away from being finished, but it will be out there. And then I think what I'm doing on Substack is probably going to be the dry run for a more polished version, whose title is as yet undetermined. So I've taken to calling it working title. That's all I can come up with for now. So I'd be happy if anybody wanted to, look at more of what I'm doing there. I think for people who are interested in exploring the idea of traditions having closer interaction with one another, or also just this specific idea of dual practice between Buddhism and Christianity, I think the Society of Buddhist Christian Studies proves still to be a very good organization that meets annually at the American Academy of Religion, but they also put a journal out that people can subscribe to. And that's a very good resource for people who want to wrestle intellectually a little bit with what the two traditions have to teach each other. And some of the folks in that society, but by no means a majority, are also dual practitioners. So that is one place people go, and the other place people might go is to read this series that I alluded to, titled in various volumes, The Gethsemane Encounter. There are some wonderful things if you like to follow that sort of writing, a kind of informal journalistic reflection on what they heard from one another. There's much to be learned there. And Zoketsu Norman Fisher has written who has a Jewish background, in his deep background, was very involved in at least a couple of those exchanges in the Gethsemane encounter, and has written a book not too long ago called a Zen-inspired version of the Psalms, a Zen-inspired translation of Psalms, and it's really lovely. Anyway, all of that to say, some of the richest encounters, in my experience, that have happened among the monks of these various traditions. They're engaging one another at the depth spiritual level of regular monastic practice, and they're just untold riches in the reports and the essays and the reflections on all those encounters. So I would commend those to your listeners as well.
Wow, those are all really wonderful resources, and yeah, I will definitely now check out that book that I have and look more into it. And it's really wonderful to hear that Reverend Norman Fisher's Zen approach to the Psalms. What was it? Zen translation of the Psalms?
I think the subtitle, at least, is a Zen-inspired translation of the Psalms.
Yeah,
really quite extraordinary.
I've seen that cover circulate around, so I'll definitely have to check that out as well. And I would definitely, to anyone that's interested in joining the Substack, your writing is so carefully done and so very readable, so very accessible. So I would definitely encourage people to read the Substack as well. Crossings, right?
Crossings.
And
I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course, Reverend Farwell. Thank you so much, James, for speaking with me today. I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, and what a wonderful treat to speak with you, and I hope to connect with you again soon.
Likewise, I immensely enjoyed this, and I'm glad we connected at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. That was a treasure.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.